Good day, I'm Andri, and once again, I'm warmly welcoming you to my Sufi Life Design lectures. Today, I shall be introducing you to three thinkers that are really at the edge of being, one philosopher and two Sufi masters. This lecture will bring together Martin Heidegger, Mansur al Hallāj, and Muḥyīddin ibn al-Arabī around a single demanding question. What does it mean for being, Sein, al-Hallaj, al-Wujūd, to be the ultimate real, and what happens to the I in its presence? Martin Heidegger rethinks being beyond metaphysics as the clearing in which entities appear. What about al-Hallaj? He experiences the real al-Haqq as a mystical identity that annihilates the ego. And great Andalusian Sufi master of all masters, Ibn Arabi, articulates a systematic ontology of al-Wujūd as the only real, with the world as its self-disclosure. So we will not flatten them into one doctrine. This is not my intention here. Instead, we shall trace convergences and tensions in the treatment of being, of truth, of selfhood, and also of language. So we shall start with Martin Heidegger, his notion of Sein and truth as unconcealment. For Martin Heidegger, being, Sein, is not a highest entity. It is the condition of possibility for any entity to appear at all. So traditional metaphysics, he argues, has forgotten this difference between being and beings, which means between Seinsfrage versus Seindes. Being is, according to Heidegger, no thing, not an object among objects. The being is the clearing, Lichtung, the open region in which beings can show themselves. Heidegger reinterprets truth on this very path as unconcealment, al-Hallaj. Truth is not primarily correspondence between proposition and the fact. According to him, the truth is the event in which something emerges from hiddenness into the openness. Thus, being and truth are notions that interfere and that are intimately linked. That's why we are on the road to truth seen as unconcealment and Sein seen as what it is, in the way it is, unconditioned and unconditional. Being and truth really are linked, according to Heidegger, and we shall see in what way these notions are linked in Sufi tradition. Being is what grants the clearing. Truth is the happening of that clearing. The human being, the Sein, is the site where being is disclosed. But when the subject dominates, being is obscured. So Heidegger calls for letting be, Gelassenheit, which is a release of control so that being can show itself. And the self must, in this process, decenter for being to appear. What about al-Hallaj's notion of al-Haqq in comparison to Heidegger as the real and annihilation of the I, of fanna? In the Sufi tradition, al-Haqq is a divine name which means not only God, but the real, the truth, and absolute being. Hallaj radicalizes this Haqq. Only Haqq is, truly is, which means only al-Haqq is, in a genuine, fullest way. The world and the ego are manifestations, not independent realities. Hallāj's mystical path culminates in fana, which means ego is not merely humbled, it is ontologically dissolved. What remains, according to Hallaj, is the real itself. Hence his famous utterance, I shall say the most famous one, al-Hallaj, I am the real. Philosophically, this is not a claim of personal divinity. It is a claim that in the state of annihilation, the I no longer exists as a separate center. Only the real speaks. So, for Hallaj, truth is not a proposition, nor logical, nor ontological one, but the real itself. So to know truth, to get to know it, is to be taken into identity with it. Where Martin Heidegger speaks of unconcealment, of aletheia, Hallaj speaks of identity through annihilation. What about Muḥyīddin ibn al-Arabī? About his notion of al-Wujūd, Heidegger Sein, and the unity of existence. Waqtad al-Wujūd, Ibn Arabi indeed develops a systematic, structured ontology of Wujūd, al-Wujūd of being. Only being itself is real, according to Ibn Arabi. All entities are modes, forms of that one being. This is often summarized too crudely as unity of existence, but his point is more precise. Being is one, its self-disclosures are many. What about self-manifestation? The world as self-manifestation, the world as tajalli. Creation is divine self-disclosure. The names and attributes of the divine appear in the mirrors of the cosmos, and each thing is a site where being shows a particular face. Here we hear an echo of Heidegger's clearing. The world is the field indeed in which being manifests, but for Ibn Arabi, this field is explicitly theophanic. What about the human as locus of comprehensive manifestation? The human being, insan al-Kamil, the perfected human, is the most complete mirror of divine being. It is the place, this perfected human, where all names can be reflected. Only in perfected, integral human, these names can be reflected and input. The self is not simply annihilated in the process, it is rather transformed into a transparent locus of being's self-knowledge. So, if we are going one step further by making a comparative axis on being and the status of the self, we can start with Martin Heidegger by saying that the self must withdraw from metaphysical domination in this process, yet the Sein remains the site where being is disclosed. The subject is decentered, but not completely destroyed, not annihilated. In the case of Hallaj, the self is ontologically erased in fana, only al-Haqq remains. The I is no longer a distinct pole. Here, the self is not just decentered, as in the case of Martin Heidegger, it is rather absorbed. So if we mentioned Ibn Arabi and how he sees a transformation and transparency in this very process, the self is refined according to Ibn Arabi. It's very polished, not erased. It becomes a mirror in which being contemplates itself. So Heidegger sees self as clearing bearer. Hallaj sees this self as vanishing point. Ibn Arabi sees the self as a mirror reflection of being. Going to another level further by stating where truth is and is unconcealment, al-Hallaj, identity and self-disclosure. The truth as unconcealment is, according to Heidegger, in this process, is in ontology of being, is unconcealment, an event, which means ereignis, as Heidegger would have stated, in which beings emerge into openness. Hallaj sees truth as the real itself, al-Haqq. So to encounter truth, says Hallaj, is to be annihilated into it. And Ibn Arabi says that being self-manifestation is a sign of truth, is the truth. So each disclosure is the true face of the real. We can say that Heidegger positions truth in a way of how being appears. Hallaj understands truth as being itself, being that speaks through the annihilated self, and Ibn Arabi positions truth as a mode of being self-appearance. Now, going to a comparative axis with language, what it is and how it manifests through all of this, like house of being, theophany, symbolic articulation in Sufi tradition, Heidegger understands language as the house of being, and language is where being dwells. Indeed, Heidegger stated himself that poetic speech can reveal being more deeply than conceptual discourse. So Hallaj, unlike Heidegger, understands language as a divine utterance. In Fana, language is no longer human. al-Hallaj is the real, speaking through a human mouth. And Ibn Arabi, how understands language is as a symbolical map of being itself. His dense and well-structured metaphysical prose and symbolic narratives really articulate structures of self-disclosure, and thus language is seen as a cartography of being's modes. So if we summarize all of these three understandings and positions according to what language is and how it operates in accordance with being and beings, Heidegger says that language is really site of being saying. Hallaj says that language is God saying through the annihilated self, and Ibn Arabi understands language as a systematic exposition of being's self-manifestation. So bringing Sufism into dialogue with philosophy, especially with Heidegger's philosophy of Sein and Dasein, yields both deep resonances and irreducible differences. So where are resonances and where are differences? Well, all three philosopher and Sufi masters reject a merely objectifying concept of truth. Also, they're seeing being, real, al-Haqq, as prior to and beyond entities. And all three of them do really insist that the subject must be transformed or displaced for being to show, for being to appear. And where are differences in all of this? Heidegger's being is non-theistic, unlike in case of Arabī and Hallaj. It is structurally open, not explicitly divine. Hallaj's real is quite personal. It's intimate, it's absolute, and theologically charged. And Ibn Arabi's being is explicitly God with a detailed doctrine of names and God's attributes. So to summarize this, Heidegger gives us a kind of a phenomenology of being's clearing and being's complete showing in its purity. Hallaj gives us a mystical identity with the real through annihilation, and even Arabi gives us a metaphysical system of being self-disclosure. So at the end of this lecture, we are positioning closing questions for a demanding audience, because to end a serious lecture, we don't resolve, we just sharpen more and more questions that we shall be trying to deal with in outgoing lectures on YouTube channel. So we can ask ourselves, can Heidegger's non-theistic Sein and Ibn Arabi's divine al-Wujūd be seen as two ways of naming the same structural priority of being over beings, or does the theological dimension change the concept fundamentally? What is al-Hallāj's al-Hallaj? Is it compatible with Heidegger's critique of the subject, or does mystical identity in Sufi tradition really go beyond phenomenological decentering into a different register altogether? And at the end of the story, we might ask ourselves, what would a philosophy look like that takes seriously both Heidegger's clearing and Sufi annihilation, where being is not only unconcealment, al-Tkhaya, but also a consuming fire? That's the frontier where our incoming lectures shall be positioned, between phenomenology and mysticism, between Sein and al-Hallaj, between phenomenology and Sufi tradition, and between thinking being and being taken by the real.